Hi, everyone. Welcome to Tapping the Wine Cellar, where we are discussing In Water and in Blood by Father Robert Schreider. We're on chapter 6 this week, and we're going to start, as usual, with a short introduction by Father Keith Branson. So, Father Keith, take it away.
The 6th chapter of In Water and in Blood focuses on the Last Supper, Luke's account of the Last Supper. In some ways, you could say this is central to the spirituality of the precious blood, the Eucharist. There are several things about the Lucan account. The blood of Christ is the blood of the new covenant, which is a reference. This is how the Seder meal ties together with the Eucharist. It's a celebration of deliverance. It's a celebration of moving from slavery to freedom. And when we talk about the Eucharist, we're talking about the core of our faith. In Luke, in the Last Supper account, says, "Take this, all of you, and drink from it. This is my blood poured out for you." In Matthew and Mark, the line is, "This is the blood poured out for many." And so this is a key distinction for Luke. In the Eucharist, we have both forms. This is a blood poured out for you and many. The cup of the Eucharist is a cup of suffering and a cup of blessing. And so it's these cups and the interplay between. We're called to be a people celebrating, like Psalm 116 says, "I will take up the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord." We also have the cup of suffering. And when we touch the chalice, when we touch the cup of communion, we're touching everyone else who touches the chalice. So we are connected to everybody we share communion with around the world. And my goodness, won't it be a great day when we can share communion from the chalice again, when the pandemic's over. But that bond, that connection is important, and it challenges us how we view Christ's suffering, how we view the suffering of the poor, and how we stand in solidarity with them. Are we really in solidarity enough with the poor to be able to share in their sorrows and in their celebrations? And with that, I will pass it to Vicky.
Hi, everyone. This chapter I found really interesting and personally very helpful, especially with Bob's discussion of the cup of the suffering and the cup of blessing. Because as a longtime Catholic, a cradle Catholic, when people said cup of suffering, I never really could embrace that understanding, because I always felt, thanks be to God, I did not suffer. I've not suffered in my life. I've had a pretty decent life. So I really liked Bob's discussion when he said when we partake of the cup of suffering, we join in the struggle against the forces of evil and injustice. That put a whole different perspective on what the cup of suffering meant for me. And I also really, as a Eucharistic minister, and I agree with you, Keith, I long for the day when the pandemic is done, when we can have the cup back in communion again. As a Eucharistic minister, Bob challenged people and said, do we have the courage to offer that cup of suffering to one another, knowing that to follow Jesus will bring us into conflict and adversity? Sometimes, I'm not going to speak for everyone, but I know as a Eucharistic minister, you get wrapped up in what are the rules? What am I doing? What happens if I spill? What about this? What about that? And you lose sight of the intention of and the core of what we're doing as Eucharistic ministers. And I couldn't help but wonder, as I reflected on that question that Bob posed, if parish communities around the country reflected on that as part of the Eucharistic experience, would we have a different reality for communion? Would we have communion with a more humble, a more journey from the heart perspective, because we weren't, for lack of a better term, going through the motions, which sometimes you get into that rut as Catholics. We get into that rut. It's like, we know we stand up now, we sit here, and now it's time to go to communion, and we forget the understanding of that. I also really liked the idea of the cup of blessing. We don't hear a lot about the cup of blessing, I think, sometimes as Catholics, because we get so wrapped up in the suffering piece. We forget that it's a double-edged reality, that where there is suffering, there is blessing. And it's a celebration and thanksgiving of the covenant. I liked, Bob said, as Catholics, we have a choice. We can participate as guests in this celebration, very on the surface, very peripheral, or we can go deeper and really walk with others through the events and experiences that they're celebrating together. I know for my life personally as a parish minister, I can think back to the celebrations of the Eucharist that we had for dear friends when they were married or baptizing children. Those were significant events for me because we walked that journey together, just as I walked with families when they were burying their dead. Those were significant life events. So that really resonated for me. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Greg.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be back with you. What caught my attention, the first thing from this chapter was this notion of the cup. Bob says that the sharing of the cup bonds together those who partake of it in the new covenant of the Messianic kingdom. A little bit further down, he says that the life force of God courses through the veins of those who accept this invitation. And for me, that opened up a new perspective on what it means to receive communion and to also be in communion with other people. We get both the vertical and the horizontal aspect of it. We're in communion with God, the one that we receive, but then those who receive we're also in communion with as well, in communion with our neighbor, in communion with those that we may not agree with, those we may not like. In that notion of, that being in communion, that impacts the way that we view ourselves as people made in the image and likeness of God, but also as neighbor, as a people. Those who've received the very life force of God, they have intrinsic value. How does that impact the way that we live in communion with one another? Later on in the chapter, Bob talks about how the blood of Christ bonds together the world with God and wipes away the sin at the same time. So again, just kind of further emphasizing that communion, it's much more nuanced and much more complex than what we often talk about or think about. The second point that caught my attention was when Bob talks about the tradition in Israel of rejecting the prophets. We hear in the Old Testament, there's a whole list of prophets that have come to Israel to try and bring them back to communion with God, to bring God's message to them, but they end up being rejected. But the paradox is that their rejection becomes the affirmation of their message. And then Bob situates the message of Christ's life within a similar narrative like that. Christ comes to bring the good news to the poor, and to free captives. In that his death on the surface looks like it's a complete rejection. And the way that he died, crucifixion was used to suppress entire movements, suppress messages. But then looking back at the narrative, we see that it's an affirmation, and the way that the Christian community has grown from there, I think we can see that it's an affirmation. And we're called to carry that information out in the way that we live. I'll pass it on to Newton.
Hello, everyone. As I've been listening and reflecting on the reading, I really wanted to focus first on this idea of the cup of blessing. And I think listening to, especially what Vicky said about something that happens that sort of becomes, we become ambivalent to, I was wondering how often we would think of the cup of blessing, and here Bob Schreiter describes it as is a celebration and a thanksgiving for the covenant, how many of us would think of that covenant as something that happens to me, as opposed to simply just something that happens? I especially think about in the Jewish tradition, where at the Passover dinner, the young child may ask, why is this night different from other nights? And there is a recounting of the covenant process itself. Why are we here and what does it mean for us to be here? I think it's important that each person knows what that means for themselves, because as I think Greg also said, the blessing and the suffering exist in order for there to be true meaningful to what we're doing as a church. I'm especially mindful of how many people are unwilling to share in the burden that is being church today. Many young people feel disconnected from the church, and we all recognize that there are many things that we carry and burden with each other, whether it's the issues of abuse or mismanagement. We carry that as one church, as one body. And how can we do that unless we have a wonderful sense of blessing, a blessing of what it means to be church, to be together? So with that part of blessing being, I think, the key to what makes the suffering worthwhile, I wanted to ask a question, which is, what have you suffered today in order to be part of this church? And what blessing have you received today being part of this church?
For me, the way Bob handles the discussion of suffering, I think, is very illuminating. And it's helped illuminated me. And I have suffered a bit in my life. I'm an amputee. But he says that the way we're called to look at suffering is to see our suffering as a way we're united with Christ's suffering. And it's Christ's suffering that makes our suffering redemptive rather than destructive. And I find a great deal of truth in that. I don't know exactly how I've suffered today other than hearing my alarm go off this morning. But and seeing the blessings is difficult as well. I think we've have a cultural anesthetic that's been given us for a couple of millennium almost, where the Mass transitioned from being a communal celebration where all participated to a singular celebration of a priest at the altar with a server, and any others present are disconnected from it or are merely observers. And that became the habit until the time of about my parents and grandparents when we had Vatican II, and we were called to be participants in the Mass again. And it's taking us quite a while to learn how to participate in Mass, how to shape our own expectations and whet our appetite for what Christ has to offer us.
Keith, I really liked your comments about the liturgy and how the whole challenge regarding participation. And to answer Newton's questions, that's what I was going to suggest, is that because we as the ministry of the baptized, yes, we've been invited to participate, but we don't, only to the limits that the organizational church allows us to participate. And I think we get confused sometimes because we think participating is the better parts are to be the quote unquote actors. I want to be in front. I want to be in place. And Newton, you bring up the most critical piece of the participation needed of the baptized. What are we bringing when we come to liturgy? What's in our hearts? What are we bringing when we gather for prayer? That's the most important piece. That's the least visible piece, but the world as we know it, it's that challenge of how we interpret the word participation.
I like that notion of what you were talking about, Vicky, about participation. It reminded me of what I did earlier this week. As someone who's currently taking presiding courses in preparation for ordination, I had to do a practice liturgy, and I found it really difficult to, pray the parts of the Mass intentionally, because I'm so focused on keeping track of, okay, here's this part now that I'm in, here's where I have to go next, here's where I have to go in the book. So trying to, at currently at this point, I feel like I'm stuck, like trying to just figure out the motions from a presider's perspective. But my hope is that, going forward, as I get more familiar with, where do I have to go next? What actions do I have to do next? I can start entering into a more prayerful state of mind and be able to kind of, dig up this richness that Bob is kind of incorporating with the liturgy and in connection with our spirituality.
Don't worry, Greg, after a couple of years, it'll be like second nature. And I think this is, this little thing points out, I think, is why we need to celebrate Mass as often as we do. Because, we could easily say, well, why don't we celebrate Mass less often? Well, yes, there's value to that. But it's through the repetition, hopefully, that we make our sense of connection with Christ's suffering and our sense of blessing more real. We're called to practice that as we participate in Mass. We're called to enter the Spirit of Christ, or have the Spirit of Christ enter us quite literally in receiving the Eucharist, and letting that, doing it over and over and over again, hopefully leads us to the reflexes we need to live the faith in the world and to hang on to the faith when times get tough.
I wanted to also mention one of the things Greg brought up about the life force, that when we share in the cup, the life force courses within us. And I really love that image. And again, I am in awe of Bob's brilliance. And it made me reflect upon, as we as humans, if we recognize that we share the cup and in that Christ lives within us, wouldn't our world be a whole lot different? And wouldn't it, those arguments that we have in the parking lot change if that was how we guided our actions and our mentalities when we're interacting with people, especially the people who really push us to that the very edge. It's not only the people that are suffering that we need to recognize this, we need to recognize with the people who are the most antagonistic. So seeing the life force, that changes for me again, it brings a whole new richness to communion, but also to everyday life.
All right, that wraps it up for this week. We hope that this discussion was helpful as you work your way through In Water and in Blood. And I want to thank Vicky, Father Keith, Greg, and Newton for being here. And we also want to give a special congratulations to Vicky, who defended her dissertation today for her D-Min. So congratulations, Vicky, and we hope that we will see you all next week. Thanks.